In this video, we want to start the process of dissecting that first tiny application that we created in the previous video. I want to spend a few moments and look at every single line of code in that program.cs file that we were just working on as a basis for further exploration in C#. So first of all, let's go through a little review before we get started. In the previous video, we wrote code in an area between two curly braces that was executed whenever we ran our application. The code did two things. First, it printed a text statement in the Windows console, and then second, it caused the application to pause for just a moment, waiting for input before it would continue on. And then secondly, we ran the application by using that little green triangle button, the Start Debugging button. So let's do this. Let's start from the inside of that code block and work our way outward, because there's a lot of text, and I want to take the opportunity now to explain as much as I can, at least at this early stage, about what all those words and all those symbols and things of that nature, what they actually mean, what do they do for you. So let's start by taking a look at this word console, which is the very first thing that we typed in. What is it about this word console? Well, to answer that, we're going to have to take our first deep dive. And to quote Morpheus from my favorite movie, The Matrix, you take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. And so you just swallowed the red pill, whether you realize it or not. So here we go. When you learn how to write applications with C#, the syntax of C#, or rather the nouns and the verbs and the punctuation of the programming language, is half the battle. The other half is learning about the .NET framework. And I said in the installation video that the .NET framework is a protective bubble that your application lives inside of. And what I mean by that is this. When you write code, the .NET framework makes your job a lot easier in a couple of very important ways. First of all, your code runs inside of the .NET Framework runtime, which is an application that wraps around your application. The runtime takes care of things, low-level details, things like managing how the data in your application is moved into and out of memory. Similar functionality. It prevents your application from accidentally crashing somebody else's computer. And then it also does the following. It provides a library of functionality, so your code can make use of a library of code that's been written by Microsoft to take care of low-level details like displaying data to the screen, or moving data from one computer to another, or working with dates and times, or the down and dirty details of opening up files and reading them and writing them, and so on. So as a result, you get to focus on the important stuff as a programmer, the real value or the purpose of your application. So this library of functionality is called the .NET Framework Class Library, or the FCL. Some books refer to it as the Base Class Library, or the BCL. And I might accidentally use those terms interchangeably, but it's the exact same thing. It's that library of code that Microsoft makes available. So for right now, it's the .NET Framework Class Library that I want to focus on for the remainder of this video. When we type the word console.writeLine into our application, we were using some code in the library that knows how to write a line of text to the Windows console. All we have to do is just tell it what text we actually want displayed, or we get to focus on just the important part. We don't care how it writes the text, or we just really care that the text actually gets displayed into the window. So the console part of that console.writeLine, the console part is called a class. The writeLine part is called a method. The method writeLine is the part that does all of the hard work. For right now, you can just think of the class part, the console part, as a way of organizing code. Now, soon we're going to expand that definition of what a class is, but for the moment, let's just use that as a working definition. I think it'll serve us well for a day or two. So the console class has another method that's called readLine. And so Microsoft has gathered all the code together that deals with the Windows console, and it organizes them into a class called console. So later on, we're going to be writing our own classes and our own methods, creating our own libraries to organize our code. Again, we'll even expand on that definition to give it a broader definition, but let's come back to that. Okay, so the WriteLine method allows us to tell it what we want to write to the console window, and this is called a method parameter. Some methods accept no parameters. The console.readLine, we did not send any parameters into that method. However, with WriteLine, we told it we wanted it to write a string hello world into the console window. So we passed a parameter. Some methods can accept virtually infinite number of parameters, and we'll talk about that later. So you can see what I mean by parameters because it uses parentheses to define parameters. In the case of WriteLine, we have between parameters the argument hello world, and then between the readLine method we have open and close parentheses with nothing in between. That means it doesn't accept any parameters. So just a quick side note that we'll come back to just in a moment here. When we passed in the words hello world, we surrounded them with double quotation marks. So what happens if we were to remove these? Let's just have a little fun here for a moment, and we were to remove them. And notice what happens here. We get some red squiggly lines underneath of our of both words, and we try to run the application. We get an error, and if we took a look at the error list, it would just throw a plethora of problems at us, saying you got to fix all this. The double quotes tell C# that we're passing in what's called a literal string. In other words, we want literally those exact words to be displayed. As opposed to what, you might ask? Well, I'll answer that later today when we talk about variables. Since it doesn't really understand what we're getting at here, it tells us that we have a problem by virtue of the fact that it gives those red squiggly lines and all the error messages in the error list. We got to fix that, and I just did that. Okay, we'll come back to that. That was just a sidebar. All right, so moving away from that and back to the topic at hand, methods. Let's take a look at another method, the main method. And in this case, this is where we wrote the code. You can see static void main. Here we're calling a method. Here we are defining what goes inside of a method. Okay, so a method is a block of code that has a name. This squiggly lines here, these little squiggly braces, they define a code block, and in this case they demonstrate containment, meaning that the code block owns this code block. It whatever's inside of there, it owns that. And then we gave that code block a name called main. So since it has a name, it can be called, and I'm going to show you how, and more importantly why you would create your own methods later on in the week. We'll come back to that in just a moment. In the case of a simple console application, by default, the main method is the first method that's called, or rather executed. So notice that this main method defines a parameter. Here we're passing in a parameter that's to a method that's already been defined in the base class library or the framework class library. Here we're defining how a parameter for main, what it should look like. And let's table that discussion for another video whenever we get a chance to talk about methods and creating your own. I assure you it'll make a lot more sense later on. All right, so back to what we were talking about. A method is a named block of code. And for today's purposes, let's just think of a class as a container for our methods. And soon we're going to dramatically expand on that definition, but I want us to not get ahead of ourselves here. Okay, now let's back up a little bit. Here you can see we have a class defined called program. Outside of that, we have something called namespace day1. And what I want to do is kind of give you a way to think about the relationship between a method, a class, and a namespace. The namespace part that I have highlighted there, it's like a last name or a surname for your classes. It allows there to be two classes that have the exact same name without there being any conflict from the .NET Framework's point of view. So it will make a lot of sense for a while why these even exist, but trust me, as your applications grow from just a couple lines of code to hundreds or thousands of lines of code, and you need a way to organize your code a little bit better, this will make perfect sense to you. Okay, so just again, we're going to have to table another discussion for later. For now, I think you can think of namespaces like this. If I were to change the namespace to my last name and then change the class name to my first name, then you would be able to do something like this, and you would say, hey Bob, run your main method. And I would be like, hey, what Bob are you talking to? There's a ton of Bobs in the world. And you would say, oh, I'm speaking to Tabor.Bob, or Bob Tabor, as we would use the nomenclature. So namespaces help us avoid ambiguity. We're not just talking to any Bob, we're talking to Tabor.Bob. That narrows it down dramatically. So whenever we're referencing classes in both the .NET Framework class library, as well as libraries that we create ourselves, we can avoid confusion or ambiguity by defining namespaces or giving our classes a last name. So the same thing is true with the console class. We were using just console, but console has a last name as well, and it's called system. So what we could do is use console's full name here. System dot console dot writeline, and the same thing here. System.console.readline. And that would be the equivalent of us doing this. Now you might say, well, why don't you have to type in the system? Well, the reason is because we have this using statement at the very top, using system. That means that we don't have to type the namespace in. So it's the equivalent of saying, whenever you see Bob, just assume it's Tabor.Bob. Or rather, whenever you see console, just assume that we're talking about system.console. And the purpose of it really is to save a lot of typing for the developer. And as you can see, as a convenience, whenever we created a new project, the IDE automatically added some common namespaces as using statements. We can remove these, quite honestly, since we're not using any of these, so I can just highlight them and hit the delete button on my keyboard and everything would work perfectly. Again, this is just a convenience or a shortcut. As you get more experience, you probably want to keep that list trimmed down to avoid ambiguity. You don't want somebody with the last name Taylor and somebody with the last name Tabor, and then just say Bob. It would, again, add the ambiguity back in. So we want to keep that list as small as possible. Something to worry about for another day. Okay, so we've covered quite a bit here. Let's go on to this semicolon at the very end of certain lines of code that we've written, like at the end of our console.writeline. Let me change some things back here. I think this was called day one. Oh, and by default, your namespaces will be whatever your project names are. So that's how it came up with that namespace. And I believe this was program, I think. Okay. It should work regardless. Let's go ahead and run it just to make sure. Okay, it did. So I was right about that. Great. Okay, so finally let's talk about the semicolon. You can see that it exists in a couple of places throughout the application. In our using statement here in the lines of code that we wrote, the semicolon is similar to the period at an end of an English sentence. It completes a thought. Some programming languages, like Visual Basic, they only allow one thought per line of code, so you don't really need any punctuation at the end of the sentence. But with C#, you can organize multiple complete thoughts on a single line of code. And most programmers never do it, but you could do something like that and it would work just fine. Or you can take a single thought and break it up into multiple lines of code. Now, let's see if this will actually work here. Yeah, that'll work. It looks kind of strange, and probably in an application like this you would never do it. But typically whenever you write code, you want to write it so that it doesn't extend off the viewable area for your coworkers who might be working on the same project. You may have a very large screen, they may have a very small screen. So you might want to organize your code and write it in such a way that it all fits nicely. And there are some rules and some idioms around how you can best structure your code and make it readable and to make it friendly in that regard. Okay. So the line breaks and the white space, they really don't matter to C# at all. It's only the semicolons that matter. Notice also that we have some pretty intense formatting going on. We have, you know, one indentation level, another indentation level, another indentation level, and finally the code we wrote at another indentation level. And so, you know, it's completely optional. You don't have to have any indentation as far as the C# compiler or the .NET runtime or any of that is concerned. But it's so important for readability's sake that the IDE, Visual Studio, or in this case, Visual C# 2010 Express Edition, it adds the indentation by default and kind of enforces it, which is a great thing. I was going to ask, why do you suppose that is? Why do you think indentation is such a big deal? Is because reading other people's code and even reading your own code at times is really difficult. So any kind of clues or hints visually that you can get to help you break down and understand what's being expressed, very, very helpful. So indentation is good. Also, another thing that the IDE helps you along those same lines is that it uses color coding for certain text that's been typed into the code window. So in this case, class names like program and console, kind of in a greenish color, aqua, green, blue. Special C# reserved words are in a very bright blue, and as you can see, string literals are kind of in a red or a brick red. And so this makes your code more human readable. It has no benefit whatsoever for the C# compiler or the .NET Framework class library or the .NET Framework runtime, any of those. Okay, so I think we're drawing to an end here. Let's recap what we just talked about. A method is a named block of code in C#. A block of code is defined how? Curly braces, okay? A method can accept parameters as a means of sending information into the method for processing. We sent the words hello world, a literal string of characters, into the write-line method for processing. In this case, it used that literal string that we passed it to display it on screen. Parameters are accessed using an open and close parenthesis. The third thing we looked at was how Microsoft created the .NET Framework class library, which contains thousands of methods that we can call by name to perform various low-level tasks that allow us to focus on the important functionality within our applications. Number 4, classes are a means of organizing common methods together. We already said a couple of times that this is just a working definition for now. We'll expand on that idea dramatically in a couple of days. And then the fifth thing we talked about were namespaces. And we said namespaces are a means of removing ambiguity and confusion, much like the reason for your last name or your surname. It's like a last name for your classes. This is what Microsoft has done for all of its classes. It helps to organize their library of code, this massive library, into some logical containers that help you find what you're looking for so that you can more easily memorize and find those the methods that you actually need from the framework class library. Number 6, you can add a using statement, typically at the very top of the code file that you're typing in, so that you don't have to type that entire namespace that would be used by the classes and the methods that you're attempting to use. Number 7, we talked about the semicolon and how it's kind of the period, the punctuation at the end of a complete thought within your code. And we're going to revisit this on day 2, talk a little bit more about that. And then finally, indentation and code coloring as a way to help you and others read code. Okay, so awesome. You're well on your way to learning C# now. You've kind of tackled some big topics here in a very short period of time. And I would just really encourage you, keep taking baby steps. You'll have it mastered in no time. If something didn't make sense to you, reread this. Use some of the keywords. Type them into your favorite search engine, Bing, Google, whatever. And do a little bit more research. We're going to provide additional links in the study material for this lesson as well that you can go and research further and kind of grasp some of these ideas. All right, so I'll see you in the next video. Thank you.